The German Shepherd hit the trauma bay doors at full speed and the entire room scattered. Nurses dove behind crash carts. A physician stumbled backward into a supply rack and sent stainless steel trays clattering across tile. The monitor above Bay 3 screamed a continuous flatline tone, and in the chaos nobody noticed that the dog wasn't attacking randomly. He was placing himself directly over the unconscious soldier on the gurney, teeth bared, hackles up, daring anyone to come closer. Security Chief Dale Morrow already had the radio to his mouth. "Animal control, authorization pending, get up here now." And that was when the pregnant nurse nobody paid attention to stepped directly in front of his tranquilizer gun. "Don't shoot him," she said. "Something is wrong with that dog, and it isn't aggression." Dale stared at her like she'd lost her mind. The next 10 minutes would determine whether a decorated military working dog survived or was put down in a hospital hallway because nobody stopped long enough to listen. Before you find out what happened next, if you've never seen this channel before, now is the time to subscribe. Hit that button, turn on notifications, and drop a like on this video. Then scroll to the comments and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to Morrow General. Morrow General Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Callaway, Montana, a mid-sized city that served 3 counties and a significant population of active-duty military families stationed at Fort Callaway 12 miles north. The hospital wasn't large enough to have a Trauma Level 1 designation, but it handled more combat-adjacent medical situations than most facilities its size. Blast injuries, equipment accidents, soldiers who'd pushed too hard during training and blown out joints or lungs. The staff were competent, overworked, underpaid, and competent. Nora Vasquez had worked the emergency department for 6 years. She was 34 weeks pregnant, which made her a topic of constant corridor conversation. Hushed debates about whether she should still be on her feet, whether administration should reassign her, whether it was responsible of her to keep taking overnight shifts when she looked like she was about to go into labor in the supply closet. Nobody asked Nora directly. They talked around her. They softened their voices when she walked past, offered to carry things she hadn't asked for help carrying, and treated her with the particular brand of institutional tenderness that was indistinguishable from dismissal. What they didn't know, what she had never told anyone at Morrow General, was that before she became a nurse, before Callaway, before the pregnancy and the quiet apartment on Ridge Street, Nora Vasquez had spent 8 years as a U.S. Army combat medic. 2 deployments, one in a mountainous region where the evacuation windows were measured in hours and the medical gear was whatever fit in a pack. She had kept men breathing with supplies that civilian emergency departments would have called inadequate. She had worked alongside military working dog handlers long enough to understand how canine units functioned under stress, what the dogs were trained to do, what they feared, and what they looked like when something was genuinely wrong versus when they were executing protocol. She had left that part of herself in a locker the day she separated from service. Most people at the hospital assumed she'd come straight from nursing school. She didn't correct them. It was simpler that way. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Nora was finishing a medication reconciliation at the nurses' station when the radio on dispatch crackled with a Fort Callaway emergency notification. A vehicle accident on the access road, 1 critical patient, special operations personnel, and a notation that the casualty was accompanied by a military working dog that had been with the patient during the incident and was not to be separated from the unit under any circumstances. That last part was underlined twice in the incoming electronic transfer, which Nora saw because she was standing closest to the printer when it spat out the preliminary report. She read the dog notation twice. The attending physician on duty, Dr. Ellison Pratt, did not read it at all. He was already pulling gloves on and directing the trauma team toward Bay 3. The patient arrived 7 minutes later. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, 31, Special Operations, blunt force trauma to the chest and head, probable internal bleeding, GCS of 8. He was on a stretcher flanked by 2 Fort Callaway military escorts who looked like they hadn't slept since Tuesday. Behind the stretcher, on a short tactical lead held by one of the escorts, was the German Shepherd. The dog's name was Rex. I was 4 years old, a fully certified military working dog with 2 deployments under his vest, and he had not left Marcus Webb's side since the accident. The escort holding the lead, a young corporal named Dawes, looked terrified in a way that suggested the trip from the accident site had not been calm. The moment the trauma team converged on the stretcher, Rex lunged. Not at random, not wildly. He launched directly at the nearest person, reaching over Marcus's body, a trauma nurse named Patrick who had his hands on the cervical collar, and stopped himself 6 inches short, teeth exposed, a sound coming from his chest that was more warning than bark. Patrick stumbled back. Someone screamed. The supply rack went over. Dr. Pratt shouted something about clearing the area, and Corporal Dawes yanked the lead hard enough to drag Rex sideways while simultaneously looking like he might pass out. Dale Morrow, head of hospital security, was in Bay 3 within 90 seconds. He was a broad man who ran his department with the conviction that every problem had a fastest solution and the job was to find it. He assessed the situation in about 4 seconds, pulled his radio, and called animal control. "We have an uncontrolled animal in a trauma bay. I need authorization for sedation and pending behavior assessment, potential euthanasia. How fast can you get someone here?" "Dale." Nora had come in behind him. She was still holding the preliminary transfer report. "Don't." "Vasquez." He said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. "Step back. This is a security situation." "That dog isn't attacking. He positioned himself to protect. Look at where he's standing." Rex had moved. While the room had scrambled, he had repositioned himself alongside Marcus's stretcher. Not on top of it, not blocking treatment, but parallel, body angled outward, watching every person in the room with the focused attention of an animal who was doing exactly what he had been trained to do. His handler was unconscious and surrounded by strangers. Rex was guarding. "It's the same thing," Dale said. "It's not." Nora kept her voice flat. Not pleading, not emotional. Just direct, the way she'd learned to be when time was short, and she needed the person across from her to hear actual information instead of performing concern. A dog guarding a downed partner will hold position as long as nothing threatens the partner directly. He's not going to let people touch Marcus until he understands who we are. "Give me 2 minutes." "You're a nurse, not a dog handler." "I worked with K9 units for 3 years overseas." She hadn't planned to say that. She said it anyway because the alternative was watching Dale Morrow make an irreversible decision based on a 4-second assessment. "Give me 2 minutes." He looked at her belly. Not deliberately, not cruelly, just a reflex, the same reflex everyone in that building had when they looked at her these days. Then he looked at Rex, then back at Nora. "You've got 90 seconds, he said. "Then I make the call." She handed the transfer report to the closest person and walked toward the stretcher. Rex's attention shifted immediately. His head dropped a fraction. Not submission, assessment. Nora slowed her approach 10 feet out, dropped her center of gravity slightly, turned her body to a 45-degree angle so she wasn't presenting straight on, and kept her hands visible at her sides. She didn't make eye contact. She looked at the floor 6 inches to the left of Rex's front paws and let him look at her. "Easy," she said quietly. Not a command, not a plea, just a tone. "I know. He's yours. I know." Rex's ears shifted, and then the monitor above Bay 3 emitted a standard alert tone, a 3-pulse electronic alarm indicating a blood pressure threshold had been crossed, and Rex erupted. He didn't go for Nora. He spun 180 degrees and launched himself at the monitor cart, and the sound that came from him wasn't the guard dog warning of a few minutes ago. It was different. Panicked and furious at the same time, the way an animal sounds when it's in pain and doesn't understand where the pain is coming from. Corporal Dawes dragged the lead back, muscles straining. 2 orderlies grabbed the cart before it went over. Dr. Pratt shouted for someone to get the dog out of the building immediately. Dale Morrow had his radio up again. Nora stood completely still. She had seen the reaction, not the aggression, the target. Rex hadn't gone for the nearest person. He hadn't gone for her, which would have been the obvious threat if he were simply terrified and lashing out. He had gone for the monitor. Specifically, he had gone for it in the half-second following the alert tone. She filed that away. The military personnel who arrived over the next 40 minutes came in waves. First, a Fort Calloway medical liaison officer named Captain Breckett, who spoke quietly with Dr. Pratt and reviewed Marcus's incoming vitals with the expression of someone who already knew the news was bad. Then 2 more soldiers from Marcus's unit who stood in the corridor with that particular stillness that meant they were tracking everything happening around them while appearing not to. Then, around the 40-minute mark, a figure who moved differently than the others, a lieutenant colonel named Adair Marsh, Army Veterinary Corps, who had driven from the base in what Nora estimated was significantly less time than the distance should have allowed. Lieutenant Colonel Marsh was somewhere in her late 40s, short gray hair, carrying a hard-sided case that she set down on the nurse's station counter without asking permission and opened immediately. She introduced herself to nobody. She walked directly to where Rex was now contained, in a curtained side bay, leads secured to the rail, Corporal Dawes sitting on a chair outside looking like he'd aged a decade. And she stood at the curtain and looked at the dog for a long time. Rex was pressed into the corner. Not cowering, still. The kind of still that comes after sustained high-alert activity. A body that has been running on adrenaline and fear for too long and has started to conserve. "Who made the primary behavioral observations tonight?" Marsh said without turning around. "That was me." Nora came up on her left. "Nora Vasquez, ER charge nurse." Marsh turned and looked at her with the focused attention of someone cataloging information rapidly. Her gaze went to the name badge, to the belly, back to the face. "What did you see?" Nora told her. "Exactly, in the order it happened. Rex's initial positioning over Marcus, the guard behavior, the reaction to the monitor tone, the direction of the attack, the specific half-second timing between the tone and the response." Marsh listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. "You're not describing aggression," Marsh said. "No. You're describing a pain response." "Yes." Marsh turned back to the curtain. "How many monitor alerts have sounded in this department in the last hour?" 4 separate events, 3 from Bay 3, 1 from Bay 7. And the dog reacted to which ones? Nora had been counting without consciously deciding 2. Bay 3. All 3. Not Bay 7. Marsh's jaw tightened slightly. She unlatched her case. From the corridor, Dale Morrow's voice carried over the general noise. He was on the phone now instead of the radio, which meant he'd escalated past animal control to someone with actual authority. Nora caught the words liability and incident report and can't have a dangerous animal. He wasn't wrong to be concerned. He just had the wrong animal in mind. Marsh pulled equipment from the case, a device Nora didn't recognize, roughly the size and shape of a TV remote, attached to a display screen. She crouched at the curtain edge, still not entering the bay, and powered the device on. Rex's head came up. Not in aggression, in something more like recognition, which was somehow worse to watch. The idea that a dog could recognize the source of its pain and brace for it even when it wasn't happening yet. Marsh looked at the readout on her screen. Her expression didn't change, which, Nora was already learning, was how she registered information that alarmed her. "When's the last time someone ran diagnostics on this animal's tactical equipment?" Corporal Dawes spoke from his chair without being asked. "Pre-deployment check. 8 weeks ago. Standard issue." Standard issue. Marsh said it like she was quoting something she disagreed with. She stood up, closed the device, and turned to face Nora directly. "That dog isn't going anywhere tonight," she said. "And if security tries to move him, they'll need to go through me first. They're talking about euthanasia authorization." Marsh's eyes went flat. "No, they're not." She picked up her case and walked toward Dale Morrow at a pace that suggested the conversation he was about to have was not one he'd been expecting. So, the treatment of Marcus Webb proceeded without Rex in the room. Dr. Pratt and his team worked efficiently once the immediate threat of interruption was removed. Chest imaging confirmed 2 fractured ribs and a splenic laceration, which put him on a surgical fast track. He was intubated, stabilized, and moved toward the OR within the hour. The military escorts followed as far as they were allowed, then stood in the corridor outside surgery and waited. Nora stayed in the ER. Her shift technically ended at midnight. It was now past 2 in the morning, and she was still there because nobody had asked her to leave and she hadn't felt inclined to go. She sat at the nurse's station and wrote her incident documentation with the careful, comprehensive language of someone who understood that the record she was creating tonight might matter later. She included the monitor tone correlation. She included the timing. She included Rex's targeting behavior. She included everything she'd told Lieutenant Colonel Marsh with timestamps. Patrick, the nurse Rex had nearly reached in the initial response, came and stood near her workstation with a cup of coffee he clearly didn't know what to do with. "That was an uncontrolled animal, Nora. I know what it looked like. Pratt's going to file a complaint about the delay in treatment access. Marcus Webb is in surgery receiving treatment. The delay was under 3 minutes. Patrick set the coffee cup down. I'm just saying, you've got a kid coming in less than 6 weeks. You don't have to be the one who steps in front of every situation. She looked at him. Somebody had to. He left without the coffee. Nora could hear the cadence of her voice, measured, urgent in a way that didn't perform urgency, and she caught fragments, equipment serial numbers, a date 8 weeks prior, a phrase that sounded like, not the first case. Not the first case. Nora filed that away alongside everything else she'd collected tonight, in the careful internal archive she'd been maintaining for years, the one that held the things she hadn't been asked about and hadn't volunteered, the parts of herself that this hospital had never needed and therefore never found. She pressed her palm flat against the side of her abdomen, felt the shift of weight inside her, and sat with the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent an entire night being right in a room full of people who hadn't wanted to hear it. Down the hall, Marsh ended the call. A few seconds later, Nora heard her make a second one. This one shorter, clipped. 3 words audible through the distance and the ambient hospital noise. Get them here. In the side bay, Rex lifted his head for the first time in an hour and looked directly at Nora through the gap in the curtain. She looked back. Whatever was coming next, it had already started. Whatever was coming next arrived before dawn. By 4:15 in the morning, 3 vehicles from Fort Calloway had pulled into the Morrow General parking structure, and the people who came out of them were not the kind of personnel the hospital usually received at that hour. 2 wore civilian clothes that fit the way military clothes fit, too precisely, not quite relaxed enough at the shoulders. 1 was in uniform. All 3 moved through the ER entrance without stopping at the check-in desk, which meant Marsh had cleared them, which meant Marsh had been expecting them even before she made that second phone call. Nora was still at the nurse's station. She hadn't gone home. She told herself she was staying to finish documentation, and that was partially true. But the more honest reason was the same instinct that had kept her standing in place on 2 different deployments when every reasonable voice in her head was suggesting she move. The sense that she was positioned at the center of something still unfolding, and leaving would mean missing the part that mattered. She watched the 3 arrivals move down the corridor toward Marsh. She noted the hard-sided case the uniformed one carried, different from Marsh's, larger. She noted the way Marsh's posture shifted when she saw them. Not relief exactly, but the release of a particular tension, like a person who has been holding a position alone and finally has backup. Dale Morrow was still in the building. He'd planted himself near the security office off the main ER corridor and had not left, which Nora suspected was partly stubbornness and partly the awareness that something had moved beyond his authority, and he wasn't sure yet where that left him. He watched the new arrivals with the expression of a man recalculating. Nora went back to her documentation. 40 minutes later, Marsh appeared at the nurse's station. Your incident report from tonight, Marsh said. I need a copy. Hospital legal has to authorize release of... I know. I'm asking if you've completed it. Yes. Good. Marsh set a card on the counter. It had her name, rank, and a contact number, no unit designation. When legal clears the release, I want it sent to that number before anyone else gets a copy. Nora picked up the card. Can I ask what's happening with Rex? He's being evaluated by my team. The equipment he's wearing. Marsh looked at her steadily. What about it? You asked Corporal Dawes when the last diagnostic check was. You said standard issue like it meant something specific. Nora kept her voice level. And then you made a phone call for 45 minutes, and the first thing you said to whoever was on the other end was a serial number. Marsh was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, assessing. You were listening, she said. I was sitting 15 feet away. Most people don't retain serial number context. I retain everything, Nora said simply. It wasn't a boast. It was a fact she'd stated the same way she'd state her blood type. Marsh studied her for another few seconds. The equipment evaluation is ongoing. I can't share specifics. I'm not asking for specifics. I'm asking whether Rex is going to be okay. Something shifted in Marsh's face. Not softening, adjusting. That depends on findings I don't have yet. She picked up the card from where Nora had set it back on the counter and pushed it slightly closer. Get some sleep, Vasquez. You look like you need it. Everyone says that. Everyone's probably right. Marsh walked back down the corridor and Nora watched her go and felt the familiar weight of being handed a partial answer by someone who thought they were being careful. She went home at 6:15, slept 4 hours, which was 2 fewer than she needed and 2 more than she expected. She ate toast standing over the kitchen sink and drove back to the hospital because her shift started at 3, and she had stopped somewhere in the last decade of her life, being able to stay away from a situation she'd left unresolved. The ER looked different in afternoon light, calmer in the way ERs got calm. Not actually calm, just running at a lower grade of crisis. Patrick was on again, and he nodded at her when she came in with the careful neutrality of someone who had decided not to revisit the previous night's conversation. Fine. She didn't need to revisit it either. She checked the board, picked up her first patient, and started her shift. For about an hour, it was just work. A construction worker with a nail through his palm, an elderly woman with an elevated heart rate and anxiety she'd convinced herself was a cardiac event, which Nora addressed with patience rather than speed, because what the woman needed was to feel heard, not efficiently triaged. A teenager who'd broken 2 fingers during basketball practice and was trying very hard not to cry in front of his father, who was trying equally hard not to notice. Ordinary work. She did it well, which she always did, and nobody commented on that, which was also ordinary. Then Dale Morrow walked past the nurse's station, didn't look at her, and walked into the office of the hospital administrator, Dr. Cynthia Pelham, and closed the door. Nora kept her eyes on her current chart. 15 minutes later, Pelham's assistant came to find her. Cynthia Pelham was 52, ran Morrow General, with the efficiency of someone who had spent her career managing institutions rather than patients, and communicated in the register of someone accustomed to conversations that ended with other people agreeing to things. She was not unkind. She was extremely precise about what kindness cost. Dale Morrow sat in the chair to the left of her desk. He did not look at Nora when she came in. "And sit down, Nora." Nora sat. "I've been reviewing last night's incident documentation." Pelham had a printed copy on her desk. "And Dale's security report." "Okay. They're different documents. They describe the same events from different positions. That's expected." Pelham's expression was neutral in the particular way that meant she'd already decided something and was walking through the formality of the conversation. "Dale's report notes that you physically positioned yourself between a member of the security team and an animal he was attempting to manage. Is that accurate?" "I stepped in front of a tranquilizer gun being aimed at a military working dog that was exhibiting a pain response, not aggressive behavior. Yes." A tranquilizer, not a weapon. At that range, with an animal Rex's size, a miscalculation in sedation dosage could have been fatal, and the animal didn't need sedating. He needed the stimulus removed. "You're not a veterinarian." "No, I've worked with military canine units. I understood what I was seeing." Pelham set the report down. "Nora, you're 34 weeks pregnant. You intervened in a situation involving a large, agitated animal in a way that put you and your child at direct physical risk. I understand your intentions were sound, but the liability exposure for this hospital, the dog never moved toward me. You couldn't have known that. I had a reasonable basis to believe it, which I documented." "Your documentation," Pelham said, "also contains observations about monitor tone correlations and tactical equipment that are outside your scope as a charge nurse." Nora looked at her. "Those observations were accurate. Lieutenant Colonel Marsh confirmed them." "Lieutenant Colonel Marsh is here investigating a military equipment matter, which is her jurisdiction. Your jurisdiction is patient care." Dale shifted in his chair. He still hadn't looked directly at Nora, which she noted because Dale Morrow was not usually a person who avoided eye contact. He was a person who used it as a dominance tool. The fact that he was sitting slightly forward, shoulders held carefully neutral, suggested the conversation before she'd arrived had not gone entirely the way he'd wanted. "I'm not here to discipline you," Pelham continued, "but I need to reassign your responsibilities for the remainder of your pregnancy. Desk duties, patient coordination, documentation, no floor trauma response." Nora was quiet for a moment. "That's 3 weeks minimum," she said, "probably longer. We can revisit post-delivery. Marcus Webb is alive because treatment wasn't delayed longer than it was. Rex is alive because someone understood what was happening before a decision was made that couldn't be undone. And I'm grateful for that," Pelham said. "I'm also responsible for this facility and the staff in it." She looked at Nora's abdomen briefly. That same reflex, universal, involuntary. This isn't punishment, it's management of risk. It was both those things. Nora understood that. She also understood that arguing further in this room with these two people was not going to change the outcome and would cost her something she might need later. "All right," she said. She stood up and she left. The reassignment took effect the following morning. Nora moved from the trauma floor to the coordination desk on the second floor, a position that involved managing patient flow, interdepartmental communication, and the steady production of documentation that kept a hospital's administrative systems functional. It was not exciting work. Several of her colleagues offered condolences with the delicacy of people delivering bad news, and she accepted them without comment. What none of them knew, because she had told no one, was that the coordination desk had a direct communication line to the ER charge position, access to all active patient records in the hospital, and a view down the main corridor that gave her sightlines to 3 department entries, including the one that led to the auxiliary wing, where the military team had set up a temporary working space. She hadn't asked for that view. It was where the desk was. She documented, she coordinated, she watched. Rex had been moved to a temporary veterinary setup in the auxiliary wing under Marsh's supervision. Nora knew this because she processed the supply requisition that included specialized veterinary monitoring equipment and a dietary modification order that didn't match anything in the hospital's standard animal management protocol, which meant Marsh had written it herself. On the second day of Nora's reassignment, one of the Fort Calloway soldiers she'd seen arrive before dawn appeared at the coordination desk and asked whether there was a quiet space he could use for a phone call. His name tag said Reeves. She directed him to an empty family consultation room around the corner. He came back 40 minutes later, and he looked older than when he'd left. "Thank you," he said. "Room's available until 4 if you need it longer." He paused. He was young, 25, maybe 26, with the kind of face that hadn't fully settled into whatever it was going to become. "Were you the one who stayed with Rex last night after they moved him?" "For a while." He nodded slowly. "Corporal Dawes said someone sat outside his bay at 3 in the morning and talked to him. Said it was the only time he settled." Nora didn't say anything. "I'm Marcus Webb's team," Reeves said. "His whole team is here. We've been here since last night." He looked at his hands. "He's not... The surgeons are saying the next 48 hours are significant. They keep using that word. Significant." "It means they're watching closely," Nora said. "That's what you want them to be doing." "Yeah." He didn't sound convinced, which was appropriate because it wasn't a very convincing thing to say. "Rex and Marcus have been partnered for 3 years. Rex doesn't do well when Marcus is..." He stopped. "Anyway, I just wanted to say, what you did the first night, Dawes told us. None of us knew how bad it had gotten until we saw the security report." "How did you get a copy of the security report?" He looked at her with a slightly surprised expression. "Marsh requested it." Of course she had. "Tell Corporal Dawes Rex is doing better," Nora said. It was what the records she'd processed indicated, and it was the most accurate thing she could offer him. Reeves left, and Nora went back to her documentation, and 2 hours later, the second thing happened that she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. The supply log flagged an anomaly. It was buried in a requisition chain that most coordinators would have routed automatically. Equipment intake for the auxiliary wing, military designated, marked for restricted access. Standard enough that it would have moved through processing without a second look. Nora gave it a second look because she gave everything a second look, and because one of the line items was a diagnostic system she'd seen described in military contractor procurement documents during her service years. A system she recognized by a specific model prefix that had been controversial in equipment review circles for reasons she remembered with the particular clarity of someone who'd been in a briefing room when the concerns were first raised. The model prefix was VTAS-7. She sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled the civilian equivalent of the diagnostic logs Marsh's team had been running, not the restricted military records, which she couldn't access, but the hospital-side intake paperwork that had been filed when the equipment arrived, which listed the originating unit, the chain of custody, and the date of last service certification. The service certification date was 8 weeks ago, the same date Corporal Dawes had given Marsh when she asked about the last diagnostic check. Nora wrote both items in her personal observation log, which she kept separate from official documentation in a password-protected application on her personal phone, and she thought about the phrase Marsh had used on the phone call she'd overheard. Not the first case. and she thought about what it would mean if the VTAS-7 system had a documented problem that someone had chosen not to act on. And she thought about how many military working dogs were currently deployed with that equipment attached to them. Then she flagged the supply log anomaly through standard channels as a routine discrepancy requiring clarification, which was true and unremarkable, and which would put the item on Marsh's desk without Nora's name being the visible force behind it. The flag landed in Marsh's auxiliary wing inbox at 4:17 in the afternoon. At 4:49, Marsh walked past the coordination desk without stopping and said, without looking at Nora, "Good catch." Nora kept typing. "What?" The next 72 hours ran on 2 tracks simultaneously, and Nora navigated both from her desk on the second floor. The first track was Marcus Webb. He came out of the critical window on the second day. Improved responsiveness, stable vitals, breathing on reduced support. The surgical team was cautiously optimistic, which in surgical team language meant they thought he was going to make it, but weren't ready to put money on a timeline. His unit rotated through the ICU waiting area in shifts, and Nora processed the visitor coordination for all of them, which meant she had a functional picture of who was there, when, and what was being said in the conversations they had with the nursing staff. What the nurses upstairs were noting, which filtered down through the interdepartmental communication system Nora now managed, was that Marcus Webb was intermittently conscious, increasingly alert, and asking about his dog with a consistency that the ICU staff described as concerning from a recovery standpoint, because every time he asked and received an answer, he tried to sit up. The second track was less visible and moved faster. Marsh's team in the auxiliary wing had been running diagnostics on Rex's tactical equipment for 2 full days. Nora didn't have direct access to their findings, but she tracked the periphery, the supply requests, the communication logs, the visitor access records, and what she assembled from those edges was a picture with a clear shape. On the second evening, 2 people arrived from outside the hospital system, not military, civilian, in the specific way that meant federal. They carried credentials. Nora didn't see directly, but heard Dale Morrow describe to Pelham as agency level, which was the kind of phrase Dale used when he was trying to sound more informed than he was. They went directly to Marsh's space and didn't come out for 4 hours. On the third morning, Pelham called Nora back into her office. This time, Dale wasn't there. "The military team has formally requested your observation documentation," Pelham said. "The supplemental log you filed specifically. That's not standard hospital record. I noted it as a personal professional log at the top of the document. They've formally requested it." "Through what mechanism?" Pelham looked at her with an expression that said she found the question both reasonable and inconvenient. "A federal investigative request. They have the authority to compel." "Then they'll get it." Nora kept her voice even. "I'd like to be present for any questions about its content." "That's not usually." "I'd like to be present," Nora said again, and the tone was the same as it had been in the trauma bay when she'd stepped in front of the tranquilizer gun. Not loud, not aggressive, just the specific flatness of someone who has decided and is communicating the decision rather than opening a discussion. Pelham looked at her for a moment. "I'll pass that along." The meeting happened in the auxiliary wing. It was not a large room. Marsh was there, and the 2 federal personnel whose names Nora had now learned were Holt and Crandall, one from a federal contracting oversight body, and one with credentials she identified as Department of Defense Inspector General, and a woman who introduced herself only as Reyes and wrote down everything anyone said in a notebook rather than on a device. Nora sat across from Holt, who was 50-something, methodical, and had the kind of patience in his stillness that came from having spent a career getting people to tell him things at their own speed. "We've reviewed the incident documentation," he said, "the hospital report, the security report, and the supplemental observation log you filed independently." "All right." "The observation log contains details about equipment model designation and service certification dates that aren't typically within a charge nurse's range of attention. How did you identify the VTAS-7 reference?" "I recognized the model prefix from equipment review materials I encountered during my military service." Holt looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. "You served." 8 years, Army combat medic, 2 deployments." He wrote something down. "That wasn't in your hospital employment file." "No." "Why not?" "It wasn't relevant to civilian nursing practice, and I didn't volunteer it." Holt and Crandall exchanged a look that was brief and calibrated. The VTAS-7 designation, Crandall said. He was younger, more direct, with the energy of someone who was used to moving cases faster than the institutions around him cooperated with. You flagged the service certification date against the date Corporal Dawes cited to Lieutenant Colonel Marsh. They matched. What significance did that have for you? It meant the last diagnostic check happened at a specific time. I wanted to know whether that timing meant anything in relation to Rex's behavioral changes. What did you know about the VTAS-7 system prior to this incident? She was careful here, not evasive, precise. I knew it had been introduced as an experimental battlefield communication enhancement for K-9 tactical units. I knew there had been concerns raised in review about its ultrasonic feedback parameters. I didn't know the status of those concerns after my separation from service. Where did you hear the concerns raised? A briefing. I don't remember the designation. It was incidental to my primary duties at the time. She paused. I'm not claiming I had specific knowledge of a cover-up, if that's what you're working toward. I had a fragment that became relevant when I saw Rex's reaction to the monitor tone. Marsh spoke for the first time since Nora had sat down. Walk them through the reaction, exactly as you observed it. Nora walked them through it, the same way she'd told Marsh the first night. Sequential, specific, without editorializing. When she described the targeting behavior, the direction Rex had moved, the half-second timing, Reyes's pen moved faster. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Ms. Vasquez, Holt said, and his tone had shifted in a way she'd been trained to recognize, the shift from inquiry to something with more weight behind it. What we're working to determine is whether the manufacturer of the VTAS-7 system was aware of the feedback anomaly prior to fielding the equipment. The behavioral pattern you observed in Rex is consistent with patterns documented in 2 other military working dogs assigned to units in different states over the past 14 months. In both prior cases, the dogs were assessed as aggressive and removed from service. Nora was very still. They were assessed as aggressive, she said. Yes. And the equipment? Was serviced and reissued, Crandall said, to other units. The specific coldness of that answer settled in the room like weather. The manufacturer's service records, she said. Certification dates. Is the timing consistent across the 3 cases? Holt looked at her without expression, which was itself an answer. She thought about Marsh on the phone in the early morning hours, saying serial numbers. She thought about the federal personnel who'd arrived and stayed 4 hours. She thought about the document that had moved through her supply queue with a model prefix she'd recognized from a briefing 8 years ago in a room where the concerns were raised and then, apparently, set aside. The 2 dogs that were removed from service, she said. Where are they now? Holt was quiet for a beat. That's under investigation. It was the answer that told her they didn't have a good answer yet. She sat with that for a moment. Then she asked the question she actually needed answered. Is Rex going to be cleared? Marsh spoke again. That's the goal. Goals and outcomes are different things. I know that, Marsh said. But yes, that's where we're headed. Nora nodded. She stood to leave and Crandall said, One more thing. The supplemental observation log, the flag you put on the supply anomaly. You routed it through standard channels. Yes. Why not bring it directly to Lieutenant Colonel Marsh? Nora picked up her bag. Because information that moves through standard channels has a timestamp and a chain of custody. Information handed person to person can be questioned later. She looked at him. I've been in enough situations where the record was all that was left. I make sure the record exists. She walked out, and in the corridor she stood for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the wall, not because she was tired, though she was, deep in the specific way of someone who has been running on less sleep than she needs, but because the weight of what she'd just heard required a moment before she could move forward from it. 2 dogs. Removed from service. Equipment reissued. She pushed off the wall and walked back toward the elevator. Behind the closed door of the auxiliary wing, she heard Holt's voice begin what sounded like the start of a long conversation, and she heard Marsh respond with the kind of certainty that comes from someone who has finally put all the pieces in order and is now only waiting for the structures around her to catch up. In the ICU 4 floors above, Marcus Webb's vitals were holding steady. And in the veterinary bay at the end of the auxiliary wing corridor, Rex had eaten for the first time since arriving at Morrow General. A small thing, a routine thing, the kind of detail that gets noted in a record and forgotten, except that Lieutenant Colonel Marsh had been told immediately, and she had stood in the doorway of that bay for a full minute before she went back to work. The manufacturer's name was Delvicor Systems. Nora had not heard it in that room, but she had seen it on the intake paperwork that crossed her desk the morning the equipment arrived, and she had written it in her log 6 days ago without yet knowing why it would matter. She had a feeling she was about to find out. She found out 3 days later, and not the way she expected. It started with a phone call to the coordination desk at 7:40 in the morning, a blocked number, which the desk phone flagged with a small amber light, routed through the hospital's external line rather than the internal system. Nora answered it because it was her desk, and that was what she did. Vasquez. The voice was male, older, with the specific clipped cadence of someone who had spent decades in institutions, where economy of language was a professional value. I'm told you're the one who flagged the VTAS intake documentation. Who am I speaking with? Someone who would like to know whether you've shared the Delvicor name with anyone outside the investigative team. Nora was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. This call isn't coming through the Federal Investigative Channel. No. Then I don't think I should continue it. She hung up. She sat for a moment with her hand resting on the receiver, not moving. Then she picked up her personal phone and sent a text to the number on Marsh's card. 7 words, blocked call. Asked about Delvicor, external line, 0740. She didn't elaborate because Marsh would understand what the call meant and wouldn't need elaboration. The response came back in 4 minutes. Document it. Don't discuss with hospital admin yet. Nora opened her personal log and documented it. Timestamp, line source, content, duration, her response, and the fact that the caller had known both her name and her role in flagging the documentation, which meant the information had moved outside the investigative team before Marsh's people had finished their work. She noted that without editorializing and moved on to the morning's coordination queue, because the work didn't stop, and she had learned a long time ago that the best thing she could do in a situation she couldn't fully control was stay functional. At 9:15, Marsh appeared at the coordination desk. She didn't say anything about the text. She set a printed document face down on the counter, kept one hand on it, and said quietly, "We need somewhere private." The family consultation room around the corner was empty. Marsh closed the door, and Nora sat down across from her, and Marsh turned the document over. It was a service certification record, Delvicor Systems letterhead. Nora recognized the model prefix immediately, VTAS 7, unit serial numbers running down the left column, certification dates in the next column, and in the rightmost column, a field labeled Anomaly Flag Status that should have contained entries reading cleared or pending, but instead contained, across 11 separate serial numbers, an entry that read Internal Review, Deferred. Deferred. Not resolved. Not cleared. Deferred. Which in equipment certification language meant someone had identified a problem, assigned it to a review process, and then declined to halt distribution while the review was ongoing. The dates on the deferred flags ranged across a 14-month window. Rex's unit serial number was on the list. So were 2 others Nora recognized from context. The units assigned to the dogs that Holt had described as removed from service and assessed as aggressive. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "A Delvicor engineer. She contacted the Inspector General's office yesterday. She's been trying to get internal review to act on the anomaly flags for 11 months. Marsh's voice was flat in the way that meant she was managing something. She documented every internal escalation she attempted. Every one was closed without action. The call I received this morning. Yes. We think it came from Delvicor's legal division. They know she made contact. They're trying to determine the scope of external exposure before we get to formal discovery." Nora looked at the document. 11 serial numbers, 14 months. How many dogs are currently deployed with VTAS 7 units that carry these flags? Marsh was quiet for a moment. Potentially 14. We're still verifying deployment assignments. The number sat in the room between them. Rex was one of the better outcomes, Marsh said. It was not a comfortable thing to say, and she said it without pretending it was. The 2 prior cases, the dogs that were removed from service, one of them was euthanized. The assessment came back aggressive. The handler consented because he trusted the process. And by the time the unit moved on, there was nothing left to examine. Nora did not say anything. She looked at the list of serial numbers, and she thought about Rex in the corner of the side bay. The way he'd gone still after hours of sustained high alert. The way he'd lifted his head when Marcus's vitals were relayed. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Your supplemental log. The full version, not the hospital-filed summary. And a formal statement about the VTAS model recognition. The briefing you attended. Whatever you can reconstruct about the timeline of when those concerns were first raised internally." "I can reconstruct the broad timeline, not specific document designations. Broad is enough to establish that the anomaly was known, or knowable, prior to the 14-month window on that certification record." Marsh tapped the document. "The engineer's documentation covers what happened inside Delvacor. We need external corroboration that the concerns had a wider circulation, that they weren't contained to one internal review process." "How long do I have?" "Crandall wants the formal statement by end of business today. The investigation is moving faster than anticipated because of the engineer's contact. Delvacor's legal team is going to start filing containment motions as soon as they've assessed their exposure, and once that happens, the document access gets complicated." Nora stood up. "I'll have it by 2. She did. She spent her lunch break and the following 40 minutes writing a statement that was precise about what she knew, precise about what she didn't know, and precise about the distinction between the two. The kind of document that holds up under examination because it doesn't claim more than it can support. She sent it to the federal contact number at 1:57 and spent the remaining time before her afternoon duties eating a sandwich she'd bought from the hospital cafeteria and didn't particularly taste. The thing about high-stakes situations that nobody talked about enough was how much of them was just waiting while other people worked. The investigation moved forward without her visible involvement. She knew it was moving because she could read the signs in the activity around her. Holt and Crandall were in the auxiliary wing every morning when she arrived, and they left late. Reyes, who never stopped writing in her notebook, had started filling a second one. Fort Calloway had sent additional personnel, and 2 of them had taken up residence in a small meeting room near the auxiliary wing that the hospital had converted into a working space on Marsh's request. Marcus Webb was moved from the ICU to a step-down room on day 6. Nora knew this through the patient coordination system, and she processed the room assignment with the same procedural attention she gave everything else. And she noted in her personal log that his first recorded verbal communication to the nursing staff upon regaining consistent consciousness had been to ask about his dog, and that the nursing staff had told him Rex was receiving care in the facility, and that Marcus Webb had then asked to see him, and that the request had been flagged for Lieutenant Colonel Marsh to evaluate. She didn't know what Marsh had decided about that. It wasn't her department. On day 7, a new person arrived. Nora was at the coordination desk when she came through the main ER entrance, a woman in her mid-40s, business clothes, carrying a laptop bag, and moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had a meeting scheduled and expected to be on time for it. She stopped at the desk and gave her name as Whitmore, and she asked to be directed to hospital administration. "Do you have an appointment with Dr. Pelham?" "I have a meeting with the legal and compliance team. I'm with Delvacor Systems." Nora directed her to the administrative wing without any change in expression and watched her go and immediately sent a text to Marsh. "Delvacor Representative, Whitmore, heading to admin now." The response took 90 seconds. Expected. Don't engage, document. She documented it. What happened in Pelham's office over the next 2 hours was not something Nora could observe directly, but the aftermath was visible enough. Pelham's assistant came to the coordination desk at 11:40 with a request for Nora's complete hospital-filed incident documentation, everything from the first night formatted for legal review. The request was framed as routine, but the timing and the specific formatting requirement, legal review, not standard medical records, told her what she needed to know about its actual purpose. She processed the request through proper channels, which meant it went to medical records, which meant it would take a minimum of 4 hours to fulfill, which meant it wouldn't land in whoever was asking for it until mid-afternoon at the earliest. That wasn't obstruction. It was procedure. She noted the request in her log with a timestamp. 40 minutes later, Crandall appeared at her desk with an expression that was controlled in the specific way of someone exercising significant restraint. Delvacor's legal team has made a formal request through hospital administration for your incident documentation and supplemental log. The hospital-filed incident documentation is being processed through medical records. Standard turnaround. They're trying to get ahead of formal discovery. I know. She looked at him. The supplemental log is a personal professional document. It's not hospital property. It was provided to your investigation directly. Crandall leaned slightly forward. They may argue it should have been filed as official hospital documentation and claim it as institutional record. Then that's a legal argument for the relevant parties to make. My documentation practices were consistent with professional standards throughout. She paused. Is there something specific you need from me right now? He straightened. Holt wants you in the auxiliary wing at 4. I have coordination duties until 3:30. 4 is fine. He left, and Nora turned back to her screen, and in the afternoon light coming through the window on her left, she could see the parking lot and the vehicle she was fairly certain was Whitmore's rental car, still in the same space, which meant the meeting in Pelham's office was still running, which meant Delvacor's legal team had more to say than a 2-hour conversation could contain. She worked through her afternoon queue without interruption and left the desk at 3:32. The auxiliary wing felt different when she walked in at 4. The setup had expanded, another table had been brought in, and the printed materials covering it were organized with the particular density of an investigation in its documentation phase. Holt was there, and Crandall, and Reyes, and Marsh, and a fourth person Nora hadn't seen before. A woman in army uniform with a JAG Corps insignia and a bearing that suggested she had not been in Callaway long but had already assessed the situation thoroughly. Captain Nora Vasquez, the JAG officer said, which was technically incorrect. Nora had been a staff sergeant, not a captain, but before she could correct it, the officer looked down at a file and said, Sorry, staff sergeant, my notes had the wrong grade. It's been a few years, Nora said. It came out neutrally. I'm Major Trent, JAG Corps. I'm supporting the investigation on the military jurisdiction side. She gestured at a chair. Please sit. Nora sat, and for the next 50 minutes she answered questions that were more precise than anything she'd been asked before. Questions about the specific briefing, the year, the context in which VTS concerns had been raised, the chain of command she'd been operating under at that time, and whether she had any documentation from her service period that referenced the equipment review. She answered what she could and said clearly when she couldn't, and she did not speculate beyond what she knew. And at the end of it, Trent looked at Holt, and something passed between them that Nora didn't have enough context to read precisely. One more question, Holt said. The call you received on the external line, the blocked number. Did you recognize the voice? No. Any identifying characteristics? Male, 60 or older, rough estimate. Cadence consistent with someone used to institutional communication. Could be military background, could be corporate. I can't narrow it further. That's useful. He wrote something down. We're issuing a formal hold on your personal observation log as investigative evidence. You'll retain access, but the document becomes part of the official record. Understood. Thank you, Ms. Vasquez. Use the civilian form this time, deliberately. Your contribution to this investigation is significant. She stood up, and Marsh walked her to the door, and in the corridor, quiet enough that it didn't carry, Marsh said, Webb asked about you. Nora stopped. About me specifically? Dawes told him what happened the first night, all of it. Marsh looked at her directly. He wants to talk to you when he's strong enough. Okay? He's being moved to a private room tomorrow, if you're available. I'll be available. She went back to her desk and sat down and pressed both palms flat on the surface for a moment because her back ached and her feet ached, and she was 35 weeks pregnant and she had spent the last 7 days in a sustained state of alert that was catching up with her in the specific way physical debt always did, suddenly and all at once. She gave herself 45 seconds. Then she opened her documentation queue and started working through the backlog. Marcus Webb's private room was 412, North Wing, and when Nora arrived at 8 the following morning, he was awake and sitting up at an angle that the pillow arrangement behind him suggested had taken some effort. He was pale in the specific way of someone who had lost significant blood and not yet fully rebuilt, with a bruise along his left jaw that had moved from purple to the ugly yellow-green of late-stage healing, and an IV line running into his right arm that he kept unconsciously adjusting because it was in a slightly inconvenient position and he hadn't quite accommodated it yet. He looked like what he was, someone who had come very close to not being here. Vasquez, he said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected. Residual intubation probably, or just the sustained effort of getting back to functional. Sit down. I've been told sitting while talking to me is recommended. She sat. How are you feeling? Like two cracked ribs and a lacerated spleen. He said it the way soldiers talked about injuries, factually, as a description of current operational parameters rather than a complaint. They tell me you were the one who kept Rex alive that first night. I identified what was happening. Lieutenant Colonel Marsh's team did the actual work. Dawes said you told Rex I'd made it through surgery. He looked at her steadily. You sat on the floor outside his bay at 3 in the morning and told my dog I was okay. There wasn't a response to that which didn't feel either dismissive or excessive, so she didn't offer one. I've been in this unit 9 years, Marcus said. Rex has been my partner for 3. I've watched people look at a military working dog and see equipment. That's the word they use. Asset, equipment. He moved the IV line again, that unconscious small adjustment. You saw him. He wasn't hard to read if you knew what to look for. Most people don't want to know what to look for. She didn't argue with that because it was true. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of the monitoring equipment at his bedside. And she noted with a specific involuntary attention that the alert tone threshold on this unit was set lower than the standard ER configuration, which meant it would chime at a lower pressure deviation, which was appropriate for a step-down patient, but which she hadn't consciously thought about until just now, sitting in the room, listening to it. The investigation, Marcus said, they haven't told me everything. They tell me enough to keep me calm and not enough to make me try to get out of bed. That's probably the right call medically. Probably. He looked at the window. Morning light, flat and gray. Montana autumn, the kind of light that didn't have much warmth in it. The dog that was euthanized, Holt told me last night. The other case. Yes. I knew that handler. Different unit, different deployment cycle, but I knew him. He stopped. He spent 6 months thinking his dog had turned. That there was something wrong with... that Rex was like that. Broken, somehow. The specific weight of that sentence, he spent 6 months thinking his dog had turned, was something she recognized as too significant to respond to quickly, so she didn't. She let it sit for the right amount of time. He needs to know it wasn't the dog, Marcus said. Formally isn't the same as a person telling you. Formally is a document. He looked at her. You know that. Yes, she said. I know that. They sat in silence for a moment that was not uncomfortable. The particular companionable silence of two people who have both been in situations where the paperwork came later and the human part had to happen first. They're going to ask me to provide a statement, he said, when I'm cleared to. He shifted against the pillows. A small movement, but she saw the tightening around his eyes that meant the ribs were making themselves known. I have field reports from the deployment, pre-incident. I was documenting the behavioral anomalies in Rex for 3 weeks before the accident. I thought it was environmental stress. I didn't know what the sound was. Were those reports submitted through standard channels? He was quiet for a half-second too long. They were submitted. Whether they moved through standard channels after that, I can't verify. She understood what that meant without needing it spelled out. Are the reports accessible? I have copies. He said it simply, with the neutrality of someone who had made a decision before this conversation happened and was simply communicating it now. Digital backup. My unit keeps personal copies of field documentation. Standard practice for special operations. You keep your own record because records have a way of getting complicated. You should tell Holt today. I'm telling you first because you're the one who was in that bay when the rest of the room had already made up its mind. And I wanted you to know that what you did, all of it, the first night, the documentation, the VTAS flag, it's going to matter when this is over. She looked at him for a moment. He meant it, which was clear, and it was the kind of thing that was difficult to receive without either deflecting it entirely or making too much of it, so she received it plainly. Tell Holt about the field reports today, she said, before Delvacor's legal team files anything else. I'll call him in an hour. She stood to go. He said, Vasquez, and she stopped. When this is over, whatever that looks like, thank you. She nodded once and left. She was back at her coordination desk by 8:40 And at 9:03, the thing she hadn't anticipated happened, which was that the situation escalated in a direction she had not modeled. Pelham's assistant came to her desk with a written notice. Administrative review, scope of duties, pending legal hold resolution. Effective immediately, coordination staff are directed to route all requests related to the current federal investigative matter to the hospital legal office. No direct communication with investigative personnel without legal office clearance. It was signed by Pelham, co-signed by the hospital's legal counsel, and had been generated, based on the timestamp, at 8:51, 9 minutes ago. Nora read it twice. It was not a suspension. It was not a direct order to stop cooperating with the investigation. It was framed as an administrative clarification of scope during an active legal situation, which was the kind of framing that was technically defensible and practically obstructive, in a way that any competent legal team would recognize immediately. Delvacor's visit to Pelham's office yesterday had accomplished something after all. She put the notice in her documentation file, took a photograph of it with her personal phone, and texted the image to Marsh. Then she forwarded it to Crandall's contact number. Then she went back to her normal work queue because the directive said to route investigative-related requests through legal, and the patients whose coordination needs were in her queue had nothing to do with the investigation, and her job was still her job. At 9:27, Pelham herself appeared at the coordination desk, which was unusual enough that 2 nurses nearby registered it without being obvious about it. "You received the notice," Pelham said. "Yes. I've routed it to my documentation file. I want to make sure you understand the scope. It's clearly written." Nora kept her eyes on her screen. "Is there something unclear about it?" "Nora," Pelham lowered her voice. "The hospital is in a legally complicated position. We have federal investigators on site, a corporate legal team making requests, and an active patient whose case is at the center of all of it. My job is to protect this institution. I understand that. The federal team has everything they need from you at this point." Nora looked up at her. "Do they?" Pelham's expression didn't change. "I'm asking you to let the process work through the appropriate channels from here." "I've been doing that since the first night." She kept her voice even. "Everything I've provided has been through appropriate channels. Everything I do going forward will be through appropriate channels." She paused. "Is there a specific action you'd like me to stop taking?" Pelham held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, "No." And she left. Nora turned back to her screen and sat with the specific cold clarity of understanding that she was now in the space between 2 institutional forces that were both treating her as an element to be managed, and that the only reliable ground under her was her own documentation, her own record, the consistent trail she'd been building since the first night when Rex launched himself at a monitor cart, and she'd stood still long enough to notice which direction he went. Her phone buzzed. "Marsh, meeting, auxiliary wing, now, come directly. Don't stop to tell anyone." She logged her absence start time on the coordination system, normal procedure, traceable, documented, and walked to the auxiliary wing at a pace that was not running but was faster than she normally moved, one hand instinctively at her side where the weight had shifted in the last week, the baby's position changing as the final weeks compressed. She pushed open the auxiliary wing door. The room was fuller than it had ever been. Holt and Crandall, Marsh, Major Trent, Reyes with her notebook, and 2 people she'd never seen before. One in Army uniform with a rank insignia that made every other uniformed person in the room's posture adjust slightly when he'd walked in, and beside him, in civilian clothes, a woman who had the particular stillness of someone who held significant institutional authority and had learned not to advertise it. And on the table between them, in a clear evidence sleeve, was a printed document that Nora could see clearly enough from the doorway to read the header. Delvacor Systems. Internal Engineering Review. VTAS-7 Ultrasonic Feedback Parameter Assessment. Confidential. Below the header, a date. 17 months ago. 17 months. 3 months before the first dog had been assessed as aggressive and removed from service. 14 months before Rex arrived at Morrow General at 11:47 on a Thursday night. Nora stood in the doorway, and Marsh looked at her, and the expression on Marsh's face was the first time Nora had seen anything in it that resembled satisfaction. Not pleasure, not relief, but the specific look of someone who has been building a case piece by piece and has just received the piece that locks it. "The engineer's documentation," Marsh said. She kept a personal copy of this report. They knew. Vasquez. 17 months ago. They ran the internal assessment, confirmed the ultrasonic feedback exceeded safe parameters for canine auditory sensitivity, and marked it deferred. She stopped. And then they shipped the units. The room held that for a moment, and then the man with the high-ranking insignia said, in a voice that was quiet and completely certain, "I want a full military audit of every VTAS-7 unit currently in the field. I want it started today." He looked at Holt. "And I want Delvacor's federal contract suspended pending investigation." Holt nodded once. Crandall looked at Nora. "The field reports, Webb called. We're retrieving them now." Nora walked fully into the room and let the door close behind her, and somewhere in the building 4 floors above, in room 412, a man was making a phone call that was going to become part of a federal investigation record. And somewhere in the auxiliary wing's veterinary bay, a dog was doing the ordinary, undramatic thing of being alive that had seemed, 10 days ago, like it might not happen. She looked at the document in the evidence sleeve on the table and thought about the blocked phone call at 7:40 and the Delvacor representative in Pelham's office and the administrative notice that had arrived 9 minutes after she left Marcus Webb's room. And she understood with the clarity of someone who had survived 2 deployments by being honest about what the situation actually was, not what she wished it were, that the next phase of this was going to be harder than anything that had come before it. Because Delvacor's legal team now knew the engineer had produced the document, and they knew the field reports existed, and they knew where Nora Vasquez sat, which desk, which floor, which hospital. And the man who had called on the blocked line that morning had known her name before she said it. The name she hadn't been able to place on the blocked call came back to her at 11:17 that night. She was home, sitting at her kitchen table with her observation log open on her laptop and a glass of water she kept forgetting to drink, when the specific vocal quality she'd been trying to locate in her memory finally surfaced. Not a name, but a context. A briefing room. Fort Carson, 8 years prior. A procurement overview that she'd attended as a junior medic because her unit's chief had sent 3 people to cover the session, and she'd drawn the short rotation. The man who'd led that briefing had the same clipped cadence, the same institutional economy of language, and he had been introduced as a senior defense acquisition consultant with a background in Army logistics. She didn't have a name. She had a face she couldn't verify, and a role that connected procurement oversight to Delvacor's product line in a way that was circumstantial at best and clarifying at worst. She wrote it in the log with the appropriate hedging, possible voice match, unverified, context only, and sent the entry to Marsh with a note that it might be nothing but she wanted it documented regardless. Then she closed the laptop and sat in the quiet kitchen and pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed through the specific fatigue of someone who has been operating at sustained high alert for 10 days while also growing a human being, and she let herself feel it for about 3 minutes, which was the amount of time she had historically allowed herself before she decided what came next. What came next was sleep. She was 35 weeks and 2 days along, and the baby had been moving with unusual persistence for the last hour. And there was nothing she could do at 11:17 at night that the investigation couldn't absorb until morning. She went to bed and slept 6 hours without waking, which was better than she'd managed in over a week. By the time she arrived at Morrow General the following morning, the suspension of Delvacor's federal contracts had been formally announced through a Department of Defense Public Affairs statement. It was 7 sentences long, used the phrase precautionary measure pending review 4 times, and said nothing about military working dogs or ultrasonic feedback parameters. But it was public, which meant it existed in a way that couldn't be walked back. And when Nora pulled it up on her phone in the parking structure, she read it twice and then forwarded it to her personal log archive without comment. The hospital felt different when she walked in. Not dramatically different. The ER was running at its normal morning pace. The coordination desk had its standard backlog. But there was a current underneath the ordinary activity, the specific atmospheric change that happens in an institution when something significant has moved beyond its walls, and the people inside are recalibrating how they relate to it. 2 nurses at the station were talking quietly when she came in and stopped when they saw her, which meant the conversation had been about her or adjacent to her. She didn't address it. She logged in, reviewed the queue, and started her shift. At 8:40, Dale Morrow walked past the coordination desk and stopped. In 11 days, this was the first time he had voluntarily approached her workstation since the night of the initial incident. He stood with his hands in his pockets, which was not his usual posture. Dale operated with a certain physical authority that came from how he occupied space, and the hands-in-pocket stance was a compression of that, a man making himself slightly smaller. "I heard about the contract suspension," he said. "It was in the public statement. I read it." He was quiet for a moment. "The euthanasia call. The first night. You were operating on the information you had." "I was operating wrong." He said it with the specific flatness of someone for whom the admission cost something real, not theatrical guilt, just a correction of record, stated directly. "I should have given you more than 90 seconds. She looked at him. "Yes." "You should have." He nodded once and left, and that was all of it. Not a complete accounting, not a resolution, just the small and honest acknowledgement that was the most that moment could hold. She went back to her cue. The first major shift came at 10:15 when Crandall appeared at her desk. Not with a request, but with information, which was a reversal of their usual dynamic and meant the investigation had crossed a threshold. "Delvacor filed a motion yesterday evening to challenge the document hold," he said. "They're arguing the engineer's personal copy was obtained through improper channels and should be excluded." "Was it?" "She copied it before she left the company 18 months ago. She was still employed when she made the copy. Their argument is going to be thin, but it buys them time." He set a folded document on the counter. "We're executing a formal subpoena for Delvacor's complete internal communications on the VTAS-7 review process, which means their servers are being imaged today. They'll know that's coming. They already know. Their legal team has been notified per requirement." He looked at her steadily. "Which means if there's anything on those servers they don't want us to find, they've had 18 hours to address it. Can they?" "Depends on how careful they were 18 months ago about what they documented." He paused. "The engineer kept records of every internal escalation she attempted, including email chains. If those chains exist on the server, deleting them now creates a secondary problem for Delvacor that's worse than the original." "Spoliation." "Correct." He picked up the document he'd set down, which she now understood had been a prop, something to put on the counter so the conversation looked administrative from a distance. "Webb's field reports have been formally entered into the record, 14 entries across a 3-week window. Detailed, time-stamped, consistent with the behavioral pattern Lieutenant Colonel Marsh documented from the equipment diagnostics." He looked at her. "They corroborate your observation log at every point of intersection." She absorbed that. "Does that change anything materially?" "It means the behavioral record is now established from 3 independent sources. A combat medic nurse who identified the pattern in real time, a veterinary officer who confirmed it diagnostically, and the handler who documented it longitudinally before the incident." He was quiet for a moment. "It means the picture is complete." He left, and Nora sat with the phrase, "the picture is complete," and felt the particular complex weight of something she'd been building for 11 days arriving at its full shape. Not relief exactly, because the outcome wasn't resolved yet, but the specific stability of knowing that the foundation was solid, that the record existed and was corroborated and could not be reasonably disputed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marsh. "Webb has been cleared to provide formal statement. Jag is with him now. Reyes is there. He asked if you could be present." She looked at the message. Then she texted back, "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Room 412 held more people than it had on her last visit. Major Trent sat nearest the door with a recording device on the table beside her. Reyes was in the corner with Notebook 3. Marcus was sitting up straighter than before, still pale, still moving carefully around the ribs, but with more presence in his face, the quality of someone who had decided that recovering and doing something useful were not mutually exclusive activities. He saw her come in, and something in his expression settled. "You don't have to stay," he said. "I know you're not officially—" Marsh cleared my presence. "Then stay." He gave his statement over the following hour and 20 minutes. It was thorough, chronological, and unremarkable in the way that statements from people who are genuinely telling the truth tend to be unremarkable. No dramatic construction, no rhetorical architecture, just the plain sequential account of what had happened and what he had observed and what he had done with those observations. The field reports he described began on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the accident. Rex had started flinching at communications equipment during joint training exercises. Not consistent aversion, just intermittent, the kind of behavioral irregularity that was easy to attribute to stress or training fatigue. By the second week, the flinching had become acute distress responses, limited to specific tonal frequencies in the equipment's alert range. Marcus had documented each instance with timestamps and contextual notes and filed them upward through his chain of command. "Did you receive any response to those filings?" Major Trent asked. "An acknowledgement of receipt, no action notice." "Did you follow up?" "Twice. I was told the reports were under review." He paused. "The accident happened on a Thursday. The last report I filed was the Monday before." The room absorbed that. "After the accident," Trent continued, "before you lost consciousness, what do you remember?" Rex was beside this vehicle. The alert tone from the tactical comms had been running on loop because the unit was damaged in the impact. He wasn't aggressive. He was in pain. Marcus's voice didn't change in quality, but something tightened around it. "The last clear thing I remember before I went under is Rex lying down next to me, and the tone still running and not being able to make it stop." Trent wrote something. Reyes wrote something. Nora looked at the window and thought about the monitor in Bay 3 and the half-second between the tone and the response. And she thought about what it meant that Marcus Webb had been lying injured beside a damaged comms unit running the exact frequency that caused Rex unbearable pain, and that Rex had stayed beside him anyway. The statement concluded at 1:40. Trent gathered her materials. Reyes filled the last pages of Notebook 3 and opened a fourth. Marcus looked at the window for a moment after everyone else had started moving, and Nora stayed in her chair until the room thinned out. "The dog that was euthanized," he said without looking at her. "His name was Axis. The handler is Sergeant Dario Fells. He's at Fort Lewis." "Does he know about the investigation?" "Marsh called him yesterday." Marcus was quiet. "He didn't say much, apparently, just asked if it could be confirmed." He stopped. "You understand what it means. To spend 6 months thinking your dog was broken, and it was your fault for not catching it sooner." "I understand. Someone needs to tell him in person." He looked at her. "Not a formal notification, a person. That's not in my capacity." "No, but it's in mine when I'm cleared to travel." He shifted against the pillows carefully. "I wanted you to know I'm going to do that." She nodded. It wasn't her thing to do, and she didn't pretend it was, and he wasn't asking her to. He was just telling her, the same way he'd told her about the field reports, stating a decision that had already been made. She left the room at 2:03 and went back to her desk, and at 2:47 the second major shift of the day arrived. Holt called her coordination desk directly, which he had never done before. "Vasquez, the server imaging at Delvacor is complete. Their legal team is contesting the scope of the subpoena, but we have the data." He paused in a way that was not his usual precise economy. The internal communications on the VTAS-7 review process were not deleted. They left them. They left them because someone made a calculation that deletion would be discovered and create a worse problem, and that calculation was probably correct. And whoever made it either didn't read the communications carefully enough or assumed the legal framing would be sufficient to contain them. Another pause. "The communications are not containable." She waited. The engineering review flagged the ultrasonic feedback anomaly 17 months ago, as we knew. What the communications show is that the flag was escalated to Delvacor's Senior Vice President of Defense Product Development, a man named Garrett Olin, who responded in writing that the review should be, and I'm reading from the record, managed internally without external notification until commercial fielding commitments can be honored. The specific coldness of the phrase commercial fielding commitments in the context of what those commitments had produced settled somewhere in Nora's chest and stayed there. "He knew," she said. "In writing, 17 months ago, 3 months before the first affected animal was assessed and removed from service." "The fielding commitments, how many units?" "Delvacor had a contract for 340 VTAS-7 units. 289 were fielded." She pressed her hand flat on the desk surface. "How many are currently active in theater?" 41. "The audit." "The general ordered yesterday has been accelerated. As of this morning, field units are being contacted and equipment is being pulled." He paused again. "The general is holding a press briefing this afternoon. Pelham has been notified that the hospital will be mentioned in the context of the Rex case. She's been asked to make staff available for record verification, including me, particularly you. Something in his voice shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a recognition that was different from the investigative tone he'd used throughout. Your documentation record is going to be central to how this case is presented publicly. The chain from your first observation in the trauma bay to the supply log flag to the investigative statement. It's clean, completely traceable. That matters. She thought about what she'd told Crandall. I make sure the record exists. She hadn't known then how much it would matter. She'd known it could matter, which was why she'd done it. But there was a distance between those two things that she was only now crossing. The person who called me on the blocked line, she said, the acquisition consultant. We traced the call. It came from a prepaid device purchased in Denver. The number has been inactive since the morning after the call. Holt's voice was careful. We have a strong probable ID. That investigation is running parallel. It will take longer. But it's running. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, thank you for calling directly. Thank you for the record, he said, and hung up. What? The general's press briefing ran at 4:30, and Nora watched the live stream on her phone at the coordination desk because it was public and her duties were covered, and she was not going to pretend she didn't want to see it. The room was a Fort Calloway conference space, and the people standing behind the podium were the general she'd seen in the auxiliary wing, Holt, a representative from the DoD Inspector General's office, and Major Trent. The briefing ran 22 minutes, and it covered the VTAS-7 suspension, the ongoing audit of fielded units, the Delvacor contract investigation, and the case that had initiated the discovery chain, the arrival of Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb and his K-9 partner Rex at Morrow General Hospital, and the subsequent identification by hospital staff of a behavioral pattern that led directly to the equipment analysis. Hospital staff was the phrase used, not her name. She hadn't expected her name, and its absence didn't diminish anything about the moment, which was not about her. It was about 41 dogs still in the field who were, as of this briefing, being relieved of equipment that had been causing them pain for months, and about 2 dogs who had already been removed from service and whose records, the general stated clearly, would be formally reviewed. Axis. The dog at Fort Lewis, whose handler had spent 6 months thinking it was his fault. She turned the phone face down on the desk after the briefing ended and sat for a moment in the ordinary sounds of the hospital, the call lights, the corridor conversations, the distant cadence of an intercom announcement, and she let the day's accumulation settle. At 5:10, Pelham appeared at the coordination desk for the second time in the investigation, and this time her expression carried something it hadn't in any of their previous conversations. A measured, careful acknowledgement of the distance between where Pelham had positioned herself and where the situation had actually gone. The legal office has cleared all documentation requests from the investigative team, Pelham said. The administrative scope directive from yesterday has been rescinded. I saw the notice. I also spoke with Crandall this afternoon. He indicated that your contributions to the investigation were significant. She used the same word Holt had used, which Nora suspected was not accidental. I want you to know that the hospital will be formally recognizing your role in the public record. Okay. Pelham looked at her steadily. I made decisions during this process based on institutional liability concerns that, in retrospect, were applied with insufficient weight to what you were actually doing. It was not an apology. It was the institutional version of what Dale had offered that morning. A correction of record, stated as plainly as the person making it could manage. Nora accepted it in the same spirit. The floor reassignment, she said. When can I return? When your OB clears you, which I understand is at 37 weeks. 12 days. 12 days, Pelham confirmed. She started to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, the first night, when you stepped in front of Dale's line, I would not have done that. No, Nora said, honestly. But you also would have walked in that morning and looked at the situation differently than I did, and you'd have had reasons for that. Everyone in that room had reasons. Pelham nodded once and left. Nora looked at her screen and thought about what it meant that the institutional acknowledgement felt smaller than the moment itself. And that was fine. The moment itself had been about a dog in a trauma bay and a soldier on a gurney, and the acknowledgement was paperwork around the edge of that, and both things could be true at the same time. The final turn came 4 days later, and it came from a direction she had not anticipated. The Delvacore communications had been in federal hands for 72 hours when Crandall called her desk at 8:50 in the morning, earlier than he'd ever reached out before, with a voice that had the compressed quality of something that had just broken open. "The communications from Garrett Olin's account," he said without preamble. "The ones directing the review to be managed internally. We traced the distribution list." "How wide?" 14 recipients. Most are internal Delvacore, but 2 are external. He paused. One is a defense acquisition consultant who has held multiple contract advisory roles with the Army in the last decade. She was very still. "The consultant," she said. "A man named Warren Price. He was copied on Olin's directive 17 months ago, which means he knew about the anomaly, in writing, at the same time Olin did." Warren Price. She didn't recognize the name, but the role, defense acquisition consultant, Army advisory history, overlapped with the briefing room memory in a way that was no longer circumstantial. "The blocked call," she said. "We're working on confirmation. The prepaid device trace is ongoing." His voice tightened. "But Price has a documented relationship with Fort Callaway procurement going back 7 years. If he's the caller, he had access to your name and role through official channels. He was in the system. Multiple contracts. Multiple sites." Crandall's voice had something in it now that was beyond the investigative register, a controlled anger that he hadn't let her hear before. He was in a position to advocate for VTAS 7 fielding at the procurement level. If he was copied on the internal review and chose to continue advocating, that's not just a Delvacore problem. She looked at the window. Morning light again, thin and flat. When does this go to the next level? It already has. The IG referred the Price connection to DOJ this morning, which means this is no longer only a contract fraud investigation. She absorbed that. DOJ, not just IG, criminal, not just administrative. "Olin," she said, "Delvacore's SVP. His attorneys filed yesterday for cooperation consideration. He's talking." She didn't say anything. She thought about the phrase commercial fielding commitments and about access at Fort Lewis and about the 14 serial numbers on the certification record with their deferred flags. And she thought about what cooperation meant in this context. A man who had made a calculation about liability and was now making a different calculation about personal exposure. "The 2 dogs removed from service," she said. "The formal review. Both cases have been reopened. Access's records are being pulled from Fort Lewis. The euthanasia documentation is under independent review." He stopped. "It won't change what happened, but it'll be in the record." She nodded, alone at her desk, in the space where a nod meant nothing visible but was the only response the moment had. "Vasquez." Crandall's voice shifted one more time. "The record you built. First night to present. We have 14 pieces of evidence that move through your documentation chain. The prosecuting team has already noted it for the case file." He paused. "Nobody asked you to do any of that. You did it because it was the right thing to do when you were the only person in the room paying that kind of attention." She was quiet for a moment. "Is there something specific you need from me today?" she said. "No." He said it with the particular quality of someone who has realized the answer is genuinely no, that the work has been done and the record exists and it's solid. "Nothing today." She thanked him and hung up and sat for a moment with her hand on the receiver. And then her phone buzzed. Not Marcia's number. Not Crandall. A Fort Callaway extension she didn't have saved, and when she picked up, the voice on the other end was Corporal Dawes. And he sounded like he'd been awake for about 30 hours and was not bothered by that fact at all. "Ms. Vasquez, I wanted to call before anyone else did." His voice had something unsteady in it. Not grief, not relief. Something that was both those things pressed together until they became a third thing with no clean name. "They're letting Marcus see Rex this morning, in person, for the first time since the accident." She didn't speak. I thought you should know, because of the first night." He stopped. "They cleared a space in the auxiliary wing. Marsh set it up. And Rex..." His voice caught for a half second and steadied. "He knew. Before Marcus even came through the door, he was already up." She pressed her free hand flat on the desk. "Thank you for calling," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He cleared his throat. "One more thing. The general who was at the briefing, he asked for the full list of people who were involved in the first night, the whole chain." A pause. Your name is at the top of that list. She sat with that for a moment. All right, she said. She hung up. She turned back to her screen. The coordination queue had 17 items in it, and 2 of them were flagged as time-sensitive. She worked through this one at a time, the way she worked through everything, sequentially, completely, without looking for the end before she'd properly addressed the middle. Outside, the October sky over Callaway had cleared overnight, and the light through her window was sharper than it had been in days. The kind of light that showed everything at its actual scale without softening anything. Her log had 42 entries. She had never once written in it the expectation that it would matter. She had written in it because the record needed to exist, and she was the one who could make sure it did, and that had been enough reason every time she'd opened it. It still was. She reached the 17th item in the queue, resolved it, and was filing the completion note when Marsh appeared in the corridor outside the coordination area, moving at a pace that was faster than her usual measured stride. And when she turned and saw Nora through the glass, her expression carried something that was, for the first time in the 2 weeks Nora had known her, fully open. She came through the door and set a single printed page on the counter between them and said, without preface, Garrett Olin signed a full cooperation agreement 20 minutes ago. He's named Price. He's named 3 other executives. He's confirmed the directive was issued with full knowledge of the risk profile. Nora looked at the page. A summary document, 1 paragraph. And the fielded units? 41 have been pulled. All 41. As of 6 this morning. Marsh's voice had something compressed in it. The professional containment of someone who felt more than she was going to show, and was showing just enough for the other person to understand the real weight of what she was saying. Rex's record has been formally restored. All adverse behavioral notations removed. His military working dog certification is reinstated, effective today. Nora looked at the page. Marsh said quietly, It was your first observation that started the chain. All of it comes back to that bay, that night, that tone. I noticed something, Nora said. The investigation did the rest. Yes, Marsh looked at her. But you noticed it when everyone else in that room had already decided what they were seeing. Outside the window, the October light held steady and clear, the kind that didn't flatter anything but didn't diminish it either. And somewhere 4 floors down in the auxiliary wing, a German shepherd named Rex had gotten to his feet before his handler's footsteps even reached the door. And that was something no formal record would fully capture. But that had happened anyway, completely and irreversibly, in the real world where things that matter tend to happen without anyone calling attention to how much they matter until afterward. Nora set the summary page on her documentation stack and picked up the next item in her queue. There was still work to do, and she was still the one doing it, and those 2 facts remained exactly as true as they had been on the night she stepped in front of a tranquilizer gun, because someone needed to, and she was the one standing there. But now, for the first time since that night, she allowed herself to understand that the thing she'd been building in the dark, entry by entry, timestamp by timestamp, observation by observation, had held. And it had been enough. And it turned out the man on the blocked line had underestimated exactly the wrong person. 3 weeks after Garrett Olin signed his cooperation agreement, the federal indictments came down on a Tuesday morning, and the news cycle picked them up before noon. Nora was on maternity leave by then. She had gone into labor 11 days after the contract suspension announcement, at 36 weeks and 4 days, early enough to be monitored closely, late enough that the delivery team at Morrow General's OB unit was more watchful than alarmed. The labor ran 14 hours, which was neither fast nor slow, and was painful in the way that labor is painful regardless of how many times you've been told what to expect. And at the end of it, she had a daughter who weighed 6 pounds and 2 ounces and who cried with a specificity and conviction that the attending nurse described as impressive. Nora named her May. She was home with May for 9 days before she looked at the news on her phone and saw Olin's name in a headline. She was sitting in the corner of her couch at 5:40 in the morning, feeding the baby in the particular dark quiet of early parenthood, when the notification came through, and she read the headline, and then the article, and then she set the phone face down on the cushion beside her and sat with the weight of it, in the way she'd been sitting with significant things for the past month, quietly, without performance, letting it settle at its own speed. The indictment named Garrett Olin on 7 counts, including federal contract fraud, knowing concealment of a product safety defect, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Warren Price, the acquisition consultant, faced 4 counts that included conspiracy and misuse of advisory access to federal procurement channels. 3 additional Delvacor executives were named on varying combinations of the same charges. Their attorneys had released statements within an hour of the indictments becoming public, and the statements used words like vigorously defend and context will be provided, which were the words attorneys used when the documentary record was comprehensive and the defense options were limited. The documentary record was comprehensive. Nora knew that better than most. She looked at May, who had finished eating and was doing the unfocused, heavy-eyed thing that newborns did in the minutes before sleep reclaimed them. A look of absolute non-concern with the world and everything in it that Nora found both funny and, in this particular moment, clarifying. She picked up the phone again and sent a text to Marsh. Saw the news. The response came back 20 minutes later, which meant Marsh had been awake for a while. All 5 charged. Delvacor board voted yesterday to terminate Olin's contract. Stock suspended pending SEC review. Then, after a short pause, "How's May?" Nora looked at her daughter, who had gone fully asleep in the efficient, total way of newborns. "She's good," she typed back. "She's really good." She returned to work at 8 weeks postpartum, which her OB cleared with the specific caveat that she was not to spend more than 6 hours on her feet consecutively and that she was to eat actual food at actual intervals, both of which she agreed to and mostly kept. May went to a home-based childcare provider 2 blocks from the hospital, run by a woman named Georgie, who had been caring for the children of hospital staff for 11 years, and who accepted the arrangement with the calm competence of someone who had never once doubted her own ability to manage an infant. Nora's first day back, the ER felt familiar in a way that had nothing to do with how it looked. The smell of it, the specific acoustic layer of the space, the way the air moved differently near the trauma bays. She stood at the nurse's station for a moment before she clocked in and let the familiarity settle, and Patrick came around the corner and stopped when he saw her. "Welcome back," he said. "Thank you." He looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't, which was the right call, and she appreciated it. She clocked in and picked up her first patient and went back to work. And the work was exactly what it had always been. The careful, unglamorous, continuously demanding practice of keeping people functional at the worst points of their lives. She did it well, the way she always had, and the doing of it felt different now in a way she couldn't fully name but recognized. The particular quality of work that you've been away from and returned to with a clear understanding of why you chose it in the first place. The formal military recognition event was scheduled for a Friday 6 weeks after her return, and the notification came through official channels. A letter from Fort Calloway's commanding officer, addressed to Nora Vasquez, RN, at Morrow General Hospital, requesting her attendance at a recognition ceremony for personnel who had contributed to the resolution of the VTAS-7 investigation. Pelham brought the letter to her personally, which was notable, and she brought it with the particular carefulness of someone who was aware that the gesture had meaning beyond the administrative act. "The hospital will be formally recognized as well," Pelham said. "The ceremony is open to staff who wish to attend." "All right." "Nora." Pelham stopped. This was the 3rd time she'd used Nora's first name in a conversation that wasn't transactional, which was a shift in register that Nora tracked without drawing attention to. "I want to say something directly. Okay? The scope directive. The reassignment during the investigation. I made those calls based on a risk framework that I now understand was weighting the wrong things." She held Nora's gaze. "The work you did during that period, not despite those restrictions, but through them, within every rule I'd given you. I don't know many people who would have done that, who would have kept going through standard channels when the institutional pressure was against it." "The channels work," Nora said simply, "when people use them consistently. The problem is that most people stop using them when the environment gets uncomfortable." Pelham looked at her. "Is that something you learned in the Army?" "It's something I relearned here." She paused. "The Army taught me to keep the record. This situation taught me why." Pelham nodded once, and that was the whole of it, which was the right amount. The Friday of the ceremony came with weather that couldn't decide between autumn and early winter. A flat, cold sky that had threatened snow since morning without committing to it, the kind of day that kept its cards close. Nora drove to Fort Calloway in the gray mid-morning light with May in the back seat, because Georgie had a family commitment, and Nora had decided, after thinking about it for approximately 45 seconds, that bringing a 2-month-old infant to a military recognition ceremony was something she was entirely willing to do, and that anyone who found it inconvenient could manage their own feelings about it. May slept the entire drive. The ceremony space was a conference facility on the base, set up with the specific, purposeful efficiency of military event planning. Rows of chairs facing a presentation area, a podium, flags. There were more people there than Nora had anticipated, Fort Calloway staff in uniform, filling most of the rows. Morrow general personnel in a cluster near the left side. She recognized Patrick, 2 of the other ER nurses, and 3 members of the coordination team. Pelham in the second row. Dale Morrow in the fourth, sitting with the particular posture of a man attending something he wasn't sure he'd earned but had decided to show up for anyway. Marsh was near the front in dress uniform, and she turned when Nora came in, and the look she gave her was brief and direct and contained more than a look. Typically contains from someone as controlled as Marsh. Nora gave her a small nod. Holt and Crandall were there, civilian clothes, in the back row. Crandall had brought coffee, which she noted because it was exactly the kind of practical, unremarkable decision she'd have made in the same situation. He raised the cup slightly when he saw her. She raised her chin slightly back. Reyes was there too, with Notebook 4 tucked under her arm. Nora found a seat near the aisle with room for May's carrier beside her, and she sat down, and May stirred briefly and then settled back into the profound unconsciousness of infants who have decided the world can wait. The ceremony opened with remarks from the Fort Calloway commanding officer, a man named General Braddock, whose presence in the room had a quality she'd noticed in the auxiliary wing, the kind of authority that didn't require performance because the substance behind it was visible enough. He spoke for about 10 minutes, and his remarks covered the VTAS-7 investigation in terms that were factual and complete without being procedural. He talked about what the equipment had done, what it had cost, and what the chain of evidence had established. He said the name Axis. He said it clearly, with the weight it deserved, and the room adjusted in the specific way that a room of military personnel adjusts when something true and difficult is named in their presence. A collective stilling, a collective recognition. The handler of that animal, Sergeant Dario Fells, could not be here today, Braddock said. He is at his duty station at Fort Lewis. But I want the record to reflect, in this room and in the formal documentation of this event, that Axis's record has been completely cleared, that the assessment which led to his removal from service was based on falsified equipment performance data, that Sergeant Fells made every correct decision available to him with the information he had, and that the failure was institutional, not personal. The room was very quiet. That distinction matters, Braddock said. It has to matter, because we ask these men and women, and their partners, to operate on the information we give them. When the information is corrupt, the people who depend on it are not to blame for the outcome. The people who corrupted it are. He paused in the particular way of someone who means what they're saying enough to let it sit before moving on. 3 individuals who corrupted that information are currently under federal indictment. 2 more are under active investigation. The military contracts held by Delvicor Systems have been terminated, and the procurement advisory relationship held by Warren Price with the United States Army has been permanently revoked. He looked out at the room. That is the institutional accounting. The human accounting is longer, and it will take more time. But it has begun. May made a small sound in her carrier, the involuntary noise of a sleeping infant who is briefly aware of the world and then not. And the woman sitting to Nora's right glanced at the baby with an expression that was almost exactly the same as the expressions Nora had been receiving for the past 2 months. Instinctive, soft, a reflex response to something small and new. And Nora felt the particular complexity of a moment that was simultaneously about enormous institutional consequences, and about the fact that she had a daughter who was 10 weeks old and would never know any of this happened. That felt right somehow. Not sad. Right. The individual recognitions came after the general remarks. Lieutenant Colonel Marsh was recognized first for the veterinary investigation and the diagnostic work that had produced the equipment evidence. Marsh received it the way she received most things, with complete composure and a thank you that was 3 sentences and no more than necessary. Corporal Dawes received a commendation for his handling of Rex during the incident and the immediate aftermath, and when he stood to receive it, he looked like someone who was working very hard not to let his face do what it wanted to do, and Nora thought that was one of the more honest things she'd seen at the ceremony. Marcus Webb was there. He was in uniform, which she hadn't been certain he'd be ready for, and he was standing without visible pain management, which meant he had either genuinely recovered well or had decided to stand without visible pain management, regardless of the cost. She suspected both were partially true. He was recognized for his field documentation, and Braddock called his longitudinal observation record a model of what thorough, persistent field reporting can accomplish, which Marcus received with a straight face and a nod that contained the controlled quality of someone who was not going to make more of a public moment than the moment asked for. And then Braddock said her name. Staff Sergeant Nora Vasquez, United States Army, retired, currently serving as a registered nurse and charge coordinator at Morrow General Hospital. She stood up. May stayed asleep because May had already demonstrated a complete imperviousness to ambient noise that Nora suspected was going to be either extremely useful or profoundly inconvenient, depending on the situation. She walked to the front of the room, and she was aware of the people in the rows. The military personnel, her hospital colleagues, Holt in the back with his careful economist's expression, Pelham in the second row, Dale Morrow in the fourth, looking at his hands, and then looking up when she passed. And she was aware of May and the carrier at the aisle seat, and she was aware of herself, which was the particular awareness that comes in moments when you are genuinely present rather than managing your presence. Braddock looked at her directly. Not the way people had been looking at her for the past year, not the careful assessment of the pregnant nurse, not the institutional calculation of a liability consideration, not the reflexive softening of people who had decided she was something delicate or peripheral. He looked at her the way one professional looks at another when the record is unambiguous. The chain of evidence in this investigation begins with a single observation made in a trauma bay at 11:52 on a Thursday night, he said. An observation that required the observer to hold position against institutional pressure, personal risk, and the general momentum of a room that had already decided what it was seeing. He paused. Most people would have stepped back. Staff Sergeant Vasquez stepped forward. He presented her with a formal military commendation certificate and a unit coin from Fort Calloway's commanding staff, and then he did something she hadn't been told to expect. He extended his hand not in a handshake, but palm up, and on his palm was a set of Army Combat Medic insignia. These were retrieved from Fort Calloway's records office, he said quietly, and his voice had dropped to a register that was for her and not the room. Your service record was reviewed as part of the investigation documentation. These are the grade insignia from your final duty posting. She looked at them. Small, metal, unremarkable in appearance. She picked them up. The weight of them was the thing, not heavy. They were small pieces of metal, but there was a weight that wasn't physical, and she felt it move through her hands and into something she'd been carrying for a long time in a way she hadn't fully acknowledged. The specific quiet grief of a person who has set down a version of themselves that mattered and told themselves that was fine, and then spent years confirming it by not talking about it. It was fine. It had been fine. And it also had a weight that she hadn't put down entirely. And she understood that now in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone in the room, but didn't need to explain, because it was hers. You never stopped serving, Braddock said. The uniform just changed. She looked at him and said, "Thank you, General." And her voice was level, because she was a combat medic and a charge nurse and a new mother. And she had been through 2 deployments and a federal investigation in the past month of her life. And she was not going to lose her composure in front of Fort Calloway's commanding staff. She nearly did anyway. She walked back to her seat and sat down and picked up May's carrier with her free hand and looked at her daughter's sleeping face and let the moment do what it needed to do in the quiet space behind her sternum where significant things went when she wasn't going to let them be visible. After the ceremony, in the corridor outside, Marcus found her. He was moving better than she'd expected, a slight careful quality to his posture that suggested the ribs were not fully forgotten, but functional, which was the word that mattered. Rex was with him. Rex in a vest, on a lead, with the alert and settled attention of a working dog who is at work and is comfortable in that, not the desperate high-alert animal from the trauma bay, not the exhausted, pain-compressed dog from the side bay at 3 in the morning, but a dog who knew what he was doing and was doing it. He looked at Nora, and his ears moved. "He remembers you," Marcus said. She crouched down in front of Rex, which was less graceful than it had been before May because her body was still recalibrating, and she held out her hand the way she'd held it out in the trauma bay, palm up, no pressure, letting the dog decide. Rex lowered his head and pressed his nose against her palm once, firmly, and then stepped back and sat down with the precision of a dog who has decided that the interaction is complete and has conducted it on his own terms. She stood back up. "How's his hearing?" she asked. "Better. The high-frequency sensitivity isn't going to fully resolve. There's some permanent damage from the extended exposure." Marcus's voice was steady and matter-of-fact about it, which she understood as the particular acceptance of a handler who loves his animal and is honest about what the record says. He's been medically cleared for modified duties, lower noise environments, adjusted tactical protocols. Marcia's team wrote the guidelines. "Will he stay in service?" "As long as he wants to." Marcus looked at Rex. "He told the veterinary team he wasn't ready to retire. I'm paraphrasing." She smiled at that genuinely, and it surprised her slightly. Not because she hadn't smiled in recent weeks, but because this particular one arrived without her managing it. Marcus looked at May, who had finally decided to be awake, and was conducting her own assessment of the corridor with the unfocused but intense attention of a very young infant, encountering fluorescent lighting for possibly the first time. "She looks like she has opinions," he said. "She has opinions about everything. She's been awake for 20 minutes. He looked at Nora, and the expression he had now was the one from room 412. The direct, unmanaged look of a person who means what they're about to say and is going to say it plainly. "Dario Fells called me last week, from Fort Lewis." She waited. Marcia's team sent him the formal clearance for access, the full record review, the complete finding that the behavioral assessment was instrument-caused, not handler-caused, not animal-caused. He paused. "He said he'd read it 3 times before he called me. He said the word he kept coming back to was proof, that it was the difference between being told something and having proof." She thought about what she'd said to Marcus in room 412. Formally isn't the same as a person telling you. Formally is a document. She had been right about that, and she had also been not entirely right about it, because for Dario Fells, the document was what he needed. The formal proof of what had happened was the thing that 6 months of internal conviction couldn't provide. Different people needed different things. "Is he okay?" she asked. "He's working on it," Marcus said. "He's a good soldier. He's going to be fine. He just needed the record to say what the record should have said 14 months ago." She nodded. There wasn't more to add to that, and she didn't add anything. Marcus looked at Rex, who was watching the corridor with the specific attention of an animal who is listening to more of the world than the humans around him can hear. "He asked me to tell you thank you," Marcus said. "Fells. For the documentation chain. For making sure the record got built in the right order." He paused. "He said he doesn't know your name, but he knows the first link in the chain was someone who noticed something at 11:52 at night when nobody was watching." She looked at Rex. "Tell him the record was always there," she said. "It just needed someone to write it." Holt found her in this parking lot. He was alone, coat against the cold, carrying no file and no device, which was the most informal she'd ever seen him. He walked up without preamble and stood at a distance that was comfortable rather than official. "Warren Price was formally charged this morning," he said. 4 counts. The prepaid device trace was completed last week. It was him. She had known it would be him. She'd known since the voice had surfaced in her memory, and she'd written it in her log with the appropriate hedging and then watched the investigative record catch up to her instinct at its own pace. "Will it hold?" she asked. "The charges?" "Yes." He was definite about it. "The communications record is complete. His inclusion on Olin's distribution list, his continued procurement advocacy after receiving the safety data, the phone call to your direct line. It builds the picture clearly enough that his attorneys have been quiet since the indictment." He paused. Quiet attorneys typically indicate a cooperation conversation is starting. "Is it?" "Unconfirmed." He didn't embellish. "But his career in federal advisory roles is over. That's certain." She absorbed that. Price in a system he'd manipulated for a decade, a phone call he'd made to the wrong person, and now the career dismantled by the same institutional channels he'd navigated for his own benefit for years. There was a completeness to it that felt neither satisfying nor unsatisfying, just accurate. The system had worked the way it was supposed to work when people used it with sufficient persistence, and the record was built with sufficient care. "You're going back to the ER?" Holt asked. "Monday." He nodded. "We may need a witness statement from you in the trial phase, if it goes to trial. I'll be available." He extended his hand. She shifted May's carrier to her other arm and shook it, and his grip was firm and brief and professional, and in it was the acknowledgement she had not expected from him, and which landed differently because of that. The simple, direct acknowledgement of someone who had spent a career evaluating the quality of evidence and had decided this particular piece of work was what it should be. "But you built a good record, Ms. Vasquez," he said. "It was the right record," she said. "Those aren't always the same thing." He looked at her for a moment with something she thought might have been, from a man as contained as Holt, the closest thing to amusement she'd seen from him. Then he nodded once and walked back toward the facility entrance, and she stood in the cold parking lot with May and the carrier against her chest, and the unit coin in her pocket and the insignia in the small envelope Braddock's aide had provided. And she looked at the flat gray sky over Callaway, and breathed the cold air, and let the day exist at its full, complicated, unglamorous weight. She was back at the coordination desk by the following Thursday, not because she had to be, but because a patient coordination issue had come up that she could resolve in 2 hours if she came in, and she had May at Georgie's in the morning free. And the truth was that she missed the work in the specific way of someone who had been away from it long enough to stop taking it for granted. She was at the desk for 40 minutes when she looked up and saw a face she didn't recognize. A woman in her early 40s, civilian clothes, standing at the desk, with the slightly uncertain posture of someone who isn't sure they're in the right place. "I'm looking for Nora Vasquez." "That's me." The woman extended her hand. "My name is Priya Anand. I'm a biomedical engineer. I was the one who—" She stopped, started again. "I'm the one who kept the internal documentation at Delvacor." Nora looked at her. The engineer who had tried for 11 months to get internal review to act, who had kept a personal copy of the assessment, who had contacted the Inspector General's office and set the formal investigation in motion. Priya Anand looked like someone who had recently stopped carrying a weight she'd been carrying for 11 months. Not fully recovered from it, because that didn't happen quickly, but with the particular quality of a person who has done a difficult thing and is now living in the aftermath of having done it, which is its own kind of difficult. "I wanted to meet you," Priya said. "I've read your documentation log. The federal team shared the relevant sections with me as part of my cooperation record." She paused. "I spent 11 months inside that company, filing escalations that went nowhere, and I was starting to wonder if the problem was that I wasn't building the record correctly. If maybe I was missing something procedural." "You weren't," Nora said. "I know that now, but at the time—" She looked at her hands briefly. "At the time I needed the record to connect to something outside the company, to someone who could receive it and do something with it, and I didn't know how to make that happen." She looked up. "You made it happen. From the outside, without knowing what I had inside." Nora thought about that. 2 separate records built independently by 2 separate people who had never communicated, one inside the company, one in a trauma bay, that had intersected in a federal investigation in a way that neither of them had designed or anticipated. "You kept going for 11 months, Nora said. "That's the harder part." "You stepped in front of a gun," Priya said. "Tranquilizer." Still, Nora looked at her. She was the person who had started the chain from inside the system, who had written down what she saw and kept the documentation when it would have been easier not to, who had watched her escalations close without action and filed the next one anyway, who had eventually walked out of the company with a copy of the document and contacted the one office that could act on it. She had done all of that before Nora had ever seen Rex in a trauma bay. The chain ran in both directions. "Are you all right?" Nora asked. It was the most direct thing she could offer. Priya was quiet for a moment. "I lost my job, obviously. The cooperation agreement protects me from prosecution, but Delvacor terminated my contract the day the indictments were announced." She said it plainly, without self-pity and without pretending it was fine. "I have savings. I have time," she paused. "I'm figuring out what comes next." "What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet." She looked at Nora with the honest, slightly raw expression of someone who has spent a year in a specific fight and is now in the open space after it and hasn't fully inhabited that space yet. "I know I don't want to work for a company that makes decisions like Delvacor made. Beyond that, she spread her hands slightly. That's a reasonable place to start. Priya smiled. Small, tired, genuine. Someone told me you're building some kind of military medical support program at this hospital. That's in development, Nora said. Morrow General and Fort Calloway are in preliminary conversations about a veteran transition support initiative. Is it going to involve K-9 units? Among other things, yes. Priya looked at her desk, at May's photo in the small frame she'd put up when she returned, at the organizational chart pinned to the board, at the coordination queue on her screen. If there's a role for a biomedical engineer who knows more than she ever wanted to know about military equipment safety protocols, she said, I'd like to hear about it. Nora looked at her for a moment. Give me your contact information, she said. The program doesn't have a framework yet, but it will. 6 months after that conversation, the Morrow General Veteran Support and Military K-9 Rehabilitation Program held its first intake. It was not a large program. It had 2 full-time staff, a part-time veterinary consultant provided by Fort Calloway, a biomedical safety advisor whose role had been designed specifically around what they'd learned from the VTAS investigation, and a clinical coordination lead. It occupied a wing of the hospital that had previously been used for storage and which had been converted over 3 months with a budget that was smaller than ideal and a planning process that was messier than anyone had publicly admitted. Nora ran it. Not from behind a desk and not from a distance. She ran it the way she ran everything, which was by being present in the work itself, by building the documentation from the first day so that every outcome was traceable, by insisting on the kind of procedural honesty that meant the program could be examined by anyone at any time and would hold up under examination. Rex came back to Morrow General on the program's opening day. He came with Marcus, who was cleared for full duty and who had driven from Fort Calloway with Rex in the vehicle's rear compartment with the same settled, undemonstrative road presence he'd apparently always had in transit. Marcus had told her once that Rex slept for every car ride regardless of destination, which she found deeply reassuring about Rex's general disposition. He arrived at the hospital entrance and got out of the vehicle and stood in the morning light in his modified tactical vest, and he looked at the building with the alert attention of an animal arriving somewhere he has been before. His hearing aids, a modified veterinary device that Marcia's team had worked with an audiologist to develop, were calibrated to filter the specific frequency range that had caused his pain. He could hear the world at normal volume. He just couldn't hear the frequency that had been destroying him from the inside for months, and that particular absence was not a loss. It was a correction. He walked into the building beside Marcus with his head up and his gait even, and the staff who were gathered for the opening stood back just slightly. Not from fear, from recognition. The animal in front of them was not the panicked, pain-racked dog from the Trauma Bay incident. He was something different. He was what he'd always been, under the equipment that had been torturing him. A working dog, composed, trained, professional in the specific way that only animals who have genuinely internalized their purpose can be professional. He found Nora in the room the way he'd apparently already decided he was going to, directly, with the brief purposeful contact of a nose against her hand, and then the same immediate withdrawal. I know you, acknowledged, moving on. He does that with everyone he respects, Marcus said. High bar? Relatively. He looked around the room, the staff, the setup, the wall near the entrance where Nora had put up the program's charter and its founding documentation, which included a formal acknowledgement of the VTAS investigation and what it had established. You put it on the wall. It needs to be on the wall, she said, so people who work here know what this place is built on and why. He looked at it for a moment. Dario Fells is being transferred to Fort Calloway next month, he said. He asked to be. He said he wanted to be somewhere with a program like this, where people know what happened and what it means. She thought about Dario Fells reading a clearance document 3 times before calling, about access at Fort Lewis, about the record that had finally said what it should have said. When he gets here, she said, introduce him. I will. May was 7 months old on the day of the program opening, and she spent it at Georgie's doing the things a 7-month-old does, which are primarily eating, sleeping, and conducting a serious investigation into the properties of everything within arm's reach. She would never know that her mother had spent the first weeks of her life in utero at the center of a federal investigation. She would never know about the blocked phone call or the administrative scope directive or the supply log anomaly or the 42 entries in a personal observation log that had become a central evidence thread in a case that resulted in 5 federal indictments. She would grow up knowing only that her mother was a nurse and a veteran who ran a program at a hospital and worked hard and came home tired and loved her with the particular quality of love that survives difficult things and is quieter and more certain for having done so. That seemed like enough, more than enough. What Nora had understood by the end of it, not in a moment, not in a ceremony or a commendation, but across the slow accumulation of weeks in which the full weight of what had happened settled, was that the thing she had brought into that trauma bay on the night of the incident was not heroism. It was not exceptional courage or unusual instinct. It was something far more ordinary and far harder to explain, which was the simple, stubborn practice of paying attention when the easier thing was to look away. She had paid attention to a dog that the room had already decided was dangerous. She had paid attention to the direction he moved, the timing of his response, the difference between what aggression looks like and what pain looks like when an animal can't tell you which one it is. She had paid attention because she had been trained to, and because she had never fully stopped being the person her training had made her, regardless of what title she held, or what uniform she wore, or what stage of pregnancy she was in. And then she had written it down, not because she expected it to matter, but because the record needed to exist. That was the thing about records. They didn't wait for you to know they'll matter. You build them in the present with the information you have, and they do their work later, in situations you couldn't have anticipated, in ways you couldn't have planned for. The record she'd built had connected with a record built by a Delvicore engineer 11 months before, and together they had established something that neither one of them could have established alone. And the thing they established was not just the evidence chain in a federal case, but something more fundamental. The demonstration that the truth can be documented if someone decides to document it, and that the decision to document it is available to anyone willing to be honest about what they see. She was a charge nurse in a mid-sized hospital in Montana. She was a veteran with a modest service record and no particular institutional power. She was a new mother who had spent part of her labor wondering whether the investigation would fully resolve before or after delivery. She was imperfect in the specific ways that people are imperfect when they've been carrying too much for too long and haven't always managed the load cleanly. She had also been, on one Thursday night, the only person in a trauma bay who noticed which direction a dog moved. That was all it had taken to start. The mistake that Garrett Olin made, that Warren Price made, that every institution makes when it decides to manage a problem rather than solve it, is the assumption that the people who aren't supposed to matter are not paying attention, that the ones without rank or authority or institutional power are moving through the world without recording what they see, that the pregnant nurse at the coordination desk is too peripheral to be a problem. The record says otherwise. It always does when someone builds it.